The following presentation is a gift from the team at Streamline Publishing, publishers of Fine Art Connoisseur, Plein Air Magazine, and weekly newsletters Fine Art Today, Realism Today, Plein Air Today, and American Watercolor, and events, the Plein Air Convention and the Figurative Art Convention. We offer over 400 different art instruction tutorials and ultra high-quality video by the world's leading artists. If you like what you see, help us support our artists and our team with your purchase. Each video aired has a special discount code for today only in the comments section with a link to the video offered. And to see everything we do, or if you want to receive notice of new releases, new products, and new events for artists, simply click the other link, which says, "See everything we do." Thank you.
Hi, I'm Eric Rhodes with Fine Art Connoisseur and Plein Air Magazine. One of the best things you can do to learn any kind of art is to learn portraiture. Portraiture informs so much. Of course, self-portraiture is great too. If you really want to get it down, the best way to start is with a limited palette. And that's what Jennifer Balkan is going to teach you here today.
Hi, I'm Jennifer Balkan and welcome to my workshop. In this workshop, I plan to show you how I use my chromatic limited palette. I love using color. In my own work, I seek to augment nature a bit by injecting my paintings with a little more saturated color than really exists. I believe that I can create the illusion of a little more vibrancy and life than I actually see. Okay, now I'm going to take you through some of the materials and tools that I use when I'm painting a portrait. So first I've got my paint tubes over here, all of my colors, and you'll see me squeeze them out shortly. The paint tubes, the colors I use are a primary red, a primary yellow, and an ultramarine blue, plus titanium white. And these particular colors, which you'll see shortly, are really true to their color integrity. And what I mean by that is that I'm really going for a red that doesn't lean too far to orange or get too warm, or lean too far blue and get too cool. So that's what I like about these. And plus I've got transparent oxide red color, which will serve as my undersketch color for my monochromatic stage of the painting. So in regards to brushes, I like to use a variety of shape, size, and quality of hair in my brushes. I think having variety makes for different kinds of stroke quality. I predominantly use filberts, which have this little round tip to them, roundish, and then flats that have more of a sharp, chiseled edge to them. And occasionally I'll use a fan brush. And what I really like about these particular brushes is that I can load up a lot of paint and apply a good solid stroke with them. And they hold the paint pretty nicely. Depending on the quality of the hair will also determine a different kind of stroke. And the fan brush is nice for doing some edge work that you'll see me do. One thing that I think is really important in brushes is that you start with, after you sketch with maybe a smaller tip brush, you start with as big a brush as possible in laying down your paint. And then as you get further along in your portrait, that your brush size goes down a little bit, and you're able to do some more refined work. And then next I've got a palette knife. And really with my knife, I predominantly use that for mixing paint and laying it down. I don't do a whole lot of knife work in my canvas. And then I've got a solvent here for cleaning between strokes. I've got a medium. This is walnut oil. And frankly, I don't use it a whole lot. And when I teach painting, I encourage students to not rely too much on medium. I think that we get into a dependency on medium, and it thins out the paint, and then your strokes just don't look as bold and strong if you're relying on medium. So that's there just to maybe to thin out some paint that I need to loosen, but for the most part, I'm just using paint. And then next, I've got this little pocket mirror. I'll show you my fancy little pocket mirror. And this is invaluable. When I'm in my studio at home, I will work with a full-length mirror behind me at all times. It lives there. And so what that does for me is that it enables me to see a reverse image of my work, as well as add a little distance to it, too. When you're looking at your work for hours and looking at it in a particular orientation, it's really tough to see any problem areas or any mistakes that you might make. And so if some people choose to flip their painting upside down. I like looking at the reverse image and find that, basically I'll lay a couple of strokes down and then turn around, look at the reverse image, and I do that probably every several strokes I make. And and it's great because I can suddenly see poor measurement, incorrect value, and also if I'm lazy and don't feel like getting up a whole lot, I automatically add a few feet of distance between the image that I see and my work, which is great because it's really good to get some distance from your work every so often. And so those are my main materials that I use all the time while I'm painting alone. When I'm teaching, and I'll talk about these later as well, I like to use a value viewer right here, predominantly for this gradation from 1 to 10. And this is a really useful tool in the classroom where I break down my values into their lights, their middles, and their darks. I also have a color wheel that I have made with my paints. So this is the red I use, the yellow I use, and the blue I use. And I'll get into that a lot later. But I use that in the classroom as well. And then a couple other things that are handy for talking about portrait painting. I've got a Planes of the Head, a John Asaro Planes of the Head model right here, which is really, really useful to help students understand the structure of the human head. And then I've got a model of a skull. And my skull over here is great because we can get a sense for what lies underneath the skin. And we all have a unique, we all have the same anatomy, but we have a unique structure and topography, and the result of which is what causes our unique shadow shapes. Next, I'll talk about setting up and lighting my model that I'm going to be painting today. All right, now today I'm going to be discussing how I choose my painting subject. And when I choose my subject, I like to seek a variety in choosing my model in terms of complexion and age and gender. I really think that it's important to be able to paint anybody. And with my palette, with this chromatic limited palette, you can mix up anybody's skin color. So there's no limitations on that. So today I'm going to be painting Siyoung Gomez, who has become a friend and model, and I'll talk about why, or the position she's going to be posing in while I'm painting her. And so I've had Siyoung, first off, put on a red dress and have a nice little red orchid in her hair. I was thinking about, so she's light complected on the little pinkish side, And so I thought it would be really nice to have some vibrant color that could reflect off of her a little bit and have a nice have some nice contrast there. She's sitting in front of a mid-tone to dark valued fabric that's fairly neutral. Also wanted to play with a color and value that would be a nice contrast to her and what she's wearing. So with that red dress, I'm going to sort of play on some complements into the background. Another thing about background that I'll talk about a lot when I get into painting color is that in order to really feel like my subject is in space, there's space around her, there's atmosphere, and she's not just superimposed in front of some background or color, I'm going to be bringing in some of those desaturated neutrals of the background into some of her midtones, particularly some of those form-turning areas of shape that need to desaturate and cool off a little bit. So that'll come into play. So there'll be a relationship between the foreground and the background. So as far as her position today, though she's wearing this adorable Hawaiian dress, we're not really going to get much of that. What I'm interested in, I mean, basically, as you can see, I've got a 20 by 16 panel here, and I'm most interested in getting her head features and just a little bit of her bust, basically shoulders and a little bit of neckline there. So we're not going to really see much of that dress, other than the straps, which I found to be a nice embellishment to the portrait, as well as the little flowers. So there's some red playing off one another. And so as far as her body position, let's see. So right now she's facing, everything is facing forward to me, and I think it's a bit more interesting in a portrait or even in a figurative pose when the head is in a slightly different orientation than the body. So I think what I'm going to have Sion do is turn her face a little bit here. Great. So what I'm going for with her head turn is I want to be able to see a little bit of shadow along her cheek. And they typically call this a 3/4 lighting effect, and it's a really, I think, can be a successful way to create the illusion of 3 dimension in a portrait. So I see some ear in shadow on one side and not on the other. So basically I see more of one part of her face than the other part. And the part that I see more of, I have some shadow and I have some midtone. So I think that provides a nice effect in creating a strong portrait. So now her head is turned away from, in a different direction than her figure. But I think I'm going to make it even a little more dramatic by having her turn, Sion, if you would, scoot your figure a little bit in that direction. Yes. Okay. And now turning head back to what it was. So this is nice. Also, I see that we have a darker side that her head and figure and torso are casting on the fabric behind her, and we really have like a nice dissipation of light moving across her upper body. So that is a nice segue to talking about light and shadow, which I'm about to do. So I like to start by saying that my approach to painting anything, be it inanimate or animate, is to break down the wealth of information I see into a more simplified, abstract pattern of shape. So I'm taking a lot of visual, three-dimensional stimuli and lessening them or simplifying them And I find that this idea really demystifies the whole process of trying to paint a thing to look like a thing. I always tell my students that behind every strong representational painting lies a strong abstract foundation. Really getting the likeness of anything requires us to break down information and reduce it to a smaller number of values than we actually see. And we do this by squinting, something that I will be doing throughout my whole painting process and that I constantly remind people to do. So, and what that is either one can squint their eyes, take off their glasses perhaps, blur their vision out, and this really helps you see the essentials. It gets rid of a lot of detail that can be distracting. Regards to what I'm doing today, I'm obviously painting human subject matter, but I really like to emphasize that it doesn't matter what I'm painting. And I think what this does is takes away that fear of that, oh gosh, I've got to paint eyes and a nose and it has to look like a person. And we can do that and detangle that association between having something needing to look like something recognizable, but just let's make it abstract. So you've got this flat panel or canvas or whatever you're working on, and you look up front at your subject, what you see, squint your eyes, and break that information down into 5 or 7 values perhaps. And now lay those values down on your panel. And so with precision of line and mark making and correct measurement and really getting your value on point on your paper or your canvas, you look down at what you have, and then this interesting pattern of abstract shape becomes something recognizable to you. So suddenly you see, oh wow, this looks like her face, or this looks like this interior that I was trying to do. And you know, it's pretty amazing. You've turned your 2D flat panel into something that appears to be three-dimensional. And that essentially is representational art. We are painting a thing to look like a thing, and how do we do it? I like thinking about it like that because I find that it can be very intimidating, and this I really believe de-intimidates all of it. I am painting light and shadow, and I like to say that I'm not painting the color of the skin, the color of the flesh, but I'm painting the color of the light across my human subject, or the form. So here I'm going to use my John Asaro Planes of the Head model as my subject to talk about light and shadow. As light falls across the subject, note the differences in light and shadow and value change that happens. So we've got a light source coming from about over here. And with that, you'll notice some of the strongest light, the greatest illumination is happening right about here, right about top of his head and his forehead, so closest to our light source. And as we go down, going across his form, the light's a little weaker, and we have less light as it's farther away from our one direct source. And so you can see how the changes in planes of his head, we've got our front planes, our side planes, our top planes, those values, the degree of light to dark, change as a function of distance and of shape, of the turning of this particular topography here. There are two kinds of shadows. There is cast shadow and form shadow. And I'll talk about cast shadow for a second. So cast shadow happens when light's falling across a form, and that, a feature, that form, actually obstructs the light and causes a shadow to happen beneath it. So you can see here, for example, a nice cast shadow happening under his nose. Light is hitting nose And this whole area, basically the underneath plane of the nose, is obstructing light from passing over onto here. So we have this dark shadow, a cast shadow. Another kind of shadow is form shadow. And form shadow happens when light falls across a form and moves into shadow. So basically falls across a round form. And so we can see it happening on his forehead. We go from light to shadow as we turn the form. Now, Mr. Plains of the Head is very angular. So a lot more angular than a person that we would come in contact with. So we don't really have nice, smooth transitions that we'd see in an actual person. So, comparing the skull to Plains of the Head man, obviously, actually right here is a great little shot because you have light hitting the skull and we're moving into shadow right here and it's really smooth. And that little area between light and shadow is neither in the light nor is it in the dark, and we call that halftone. So it's a transition between the light and the dark. So here we go, we move into form shadow, and we can see form shadow elsewhere on this bony guy happening like right along this cheekbone here, and a wee bit of transition. It's also a bit bony and angular. So there you have it. There you have your two kinds of shadow, cast shadow and form shadow. As form turns away from the light into shadow, it will decrease. Well, as I've been saying, it goes down in value, but it also cools in temperature and loses chroma as well. So it desaturates and cools, which isn't totally relevant when we're talking about monochrome, but we'll talk about that a lot later in color. But it's something that's important to think about. So things just change as they go off into the distance. All right, now let's talk about color and mixing paint using a primary chromatic palette, limited palette. So I want to talk about the color wheel. And the color wheel is something that many of you have probably seen and made as kids. And so this will be kind of familiar to you. And so here I have a color wheel that I made, and I'm actually using the particular paints that I use all the time in making this wheel. So I've got my primary red, my primary yellow, and my primary blue, which is an ultramarine blue. In order to make this wheel, I added a little bit of white to the blue, and that's because ultramarine blue is a transparent color, and so it comes out of the tube very darkly. So I add a little bit of white just to get it about the same value as the red. And then red and yellow are opaque, so they're fine standing alone. And so with these three triadic primaries, I then mix them to make what are known as complements or secondary colors. So yellow, blue, we've got green. Red and yellow, we have orange, and red and blue, we have violet. And so there you've got the opposing colors. And then I went further and created what are known as tertiary colors. And so tertiaries are sort of the warm and the cool versions of the primaries. So you see a orangey yellow and then a greenish yellow and so forth around the wheel. And so something that's to take from this is that the way to, this is all very, very saturated color, and the way to desaturate any of these colors is to add its opposite to it. So whereas you'll see some painters actually adding gray, maybe a mixture of black and white, to their saturated color to get a neutral version, I prefer to use the colors opposite. So in order to create a grayed down red, I would add some green to it. And so basically there's this continuum from primary to secondary color in which, when perfectly mixed in equal quantities, in the middle you'll get a gray, desaturated, a brownish gray. And so theoretically, any of these crossings, you should come up with nearly the same grayish brown, completely neutral color in the middle. Doesn't really happen, but it's close. No matter what, you get grayed down versions of all of these. And so with this palette of only jewel colors, the key is to work toward making desaturated colors, so actually making your earth tones. So why do I use all these jewel tones and I choose to make my earth tones? I mix a lot. It's all about mixing when you only have a few colors to work with. The reason is I find that you can get richness in your work when you're only using jewel colors. Sometimes there's a deadening of color that happens when there's too much earthy, muddy colors that are mixed into your colors. And so with this palette, it's hard to do that. And often I find students will start out being a little too chromatic. And frankly, I prefer them to err on the side of chroma than dullness. So with this palette, it's the biggest challenge is to create muted color. And frankly, that's pretty much like what you're doing all the time. In life, as we look around wherever we are, most color is desaturated, certainly when you're working on flesh tones. And the real saturated color we see in clothing, and even after clothing's been washed a few times, your reds are never that red, your blues are never that blue. So I'm constantly thinking about opposites while I mix paint. And, again, opposites because I'm trying to, say, desaturate a purple. And the interesting thing about, for example, purple and yellow is that a purple and yellow combination is really raw umber. So earth tones can all be made from just this. So as I said, there are no earth tones, so there's no black. So what I do is I create a color that approximates black. So I'm basically trying to convince the viewer that something is black, and I'll show you how I do that in a little bit. So visual harmony can readily happen here, and visual harmony is the phenomenon that takes place when color combinations are visually pleasing to us. And this idea of visual harmony is happening because, as I said earlier, we're using all of our colors, just different concentrations of them. And so what happens is when, for example, if I am setting out to paint some flesh on, say, a light complected person's cheek that's maybe sort of a pinkish orangish color, I'll use a bit of white, a little bit of red, a little bit of yellow, and I'll mix that up and I'll come up with a somewhat peachy color perhaps that's really, really saturated, a very punchy color that's not quite natural to skin tone. And the way to cut the chroma, what I would think about it theoretically is if I have a pinkish yellowish tone that I need to desaturate, I want to desaturate it with a greenish purplish tone. So, but in my three colors, what I have to do is add the third color. That's what I have left. So I cut chroma always by adding the third color, which in that case would be a little dot of blue. And you'll see as I'm mixing that you develop a sense for how much you need to create the desired mix. It's really, really easy, especially in the early days of doing this, to go overboard and create mixes that are way off the mark of what you had intended. And I always encourage people just to start off really sparingly with your mixes. I liken it to making soup, in which you have to be very careful about some of your seasonings, because if you put a little too much salt in, you've blown it. So painting is similar. So this limited palette, as I said, can be a really tough palette to get a good handle on. It is hard to mute colors, but it is very doable. And the more you use it, the better you get. And one amazing thing out of achieving a competence over this palette or mastery is that you will have the ability to mix anything. And I really find that it's a superpower. It's like an amazing feat to be able to do that, to be able to identify just about anything you see and decide, oh, okay, how do I replicate that in paint? And if you can make mixes out of just these few paints, then you really will be able to mix anything you see. It's all about identifying the family or the hue of the color first. And once you identify what family or hue that color belongs in, then you think about what value it is, how light or dark it is, and you just start adjusting and adding little bits more chroma into it. Temperature. Temperature is relative. So something is only something is only cool or warm as a function of what it's next to. Only so cool if it's next to something warm. So just to show you a very, very small sample of what you can mix, it's pretty limitless, but I did these little palette examples for a couple different classes, just to show people the variety and the mutedness and sort of the pastelized versions of some of these mixtures. So I just grouped them roughly in light, in middle tone, and in shadow tone. And so there's quite a range of color and possibilities you can get with this palette. This over here, I did this kind of interesting little exercise in which I actually looked at a painting after I had finished it, and went back and mixed up all of the variety of paint strokes, discrete paint mixes that I had laid down after the fact, just out of, I guess, curiosity of how much I actually used. And so, again, grouped by light, middle, and dark, and I was impressing upon students on, again, the incredible range you can get and the ability to desaturate tone into earth tones that you can certainly buy at the store or happily mix them with this palette. So my approach to laying down paint is using a technique known as optical mixing, or applying broken color. And by this, I mean that I create strokes that differ in temperature, chroma, and value, and alternate them in a certain way. So basically, I'm alternating saturation, color level, and temperature as I'm descending or ascending over a form. And this, when seen together at a little bit of a distance, creates the illusion of three-dimensional form or form turning. This is a technique that was invented by the Impressionists of the late 1800s, like Monet and Van Gogh and Fetchin, for a few examples. And it's funny to think about a technique like this being invented, but they were some of the first to use this kind of method. And I just, this kind of portrayal of color and value and in representational art is just super exciting for me. I love being able to look at a painting almost as if it's a puzzle, in which each discrete stroke can't quite stand alone, though it has its own weight, but when seen together in combination, you see this beautiful image emerge. And so it's this whole that's greater than the sum of its parts. The way, I think a lot about the emotion of the sitter and just the energy behind painting a human subject. And so as I very deliberately lay down these strokes, I'm thinking about the layering of human skin, both metaphorically and physically. So this approach really, really speaks to me, and I get super, super excited by work that I see that is really rich and bold in form and holds together with strength. And then upon viewing it up close, as I get closer and closer, I can see these beautiful, discrete little pieces of paint that almost have a mosaic-like quality to them. And for some, for some artists, that is not the end in and of itself. That might be like 3/4 of the way into their final painting, in which they prefer to blend paint and make things really smooth. For me, that spot is my happy place, and I laugh in my class and say that blending is for mixed drinks and margaritas and not for painting. So anyway, with that in mind, I will show you a couple of samples of my work and just kind of identify some of this optical blending technique that I do and that I'll be doing when I'm painting. For example, here, this is an interesting little study that I did because I first painted Kelly in full monochrome with 7 values I painted her in, and I wanted to demonstrate how a great likeness can be achieved with a reduced number of values that are in monochrome. And then I did a color version of that, and really, really tried to stay grounded in my value structure when moving into color. But so if we look closely at some of these colors and strokes that I applied, you can see, like for example, coming around her cheek, some really, really warm, hot, even color, chromatic color, warm color, and that's dark in value. And then as we move across, we get a little cooler, we get a little warmer, we get cooler, warmer, cool, and the value is getting higher as we go. So to create this illusion of form turn. Here on my model Lisa's, in this particular little portrait study, we've got just looking at Lisa's forehead, which is very round, and these are some much bigger, looser strokes that I laid down. But again, going from shadow side into light, moving a halftone that's cooler, a little warmer. That actually gets a little darker and less saturated on that top plane of her head. So you can. I've really parsed out the plane work here in this particular study. So again, if you look very closely at this image, you can see a lot of discrete strokes there. But when we pull away from it, it gets tighter in view. And it's what's interesting is that in our days of posting artwork all the time and consuming artwork on social media, so many times we see images of paintings that are the size of our cell phone screens. And that work looks so tight, and it's really, really tough to see strokes. And it's funny when if I'm actually discovering somebody else's work that I get to actually see in life, or see a bigger version and realize, oh my gosh, like look at all those strokes that I couldn't even see in that small image. And I think that happens with my work as well. As you tighten it up, or reduce its size, you can no longer see all those discrete strokes, but they're there. Okay, after all that talk about color, we are now ready to do some mixing and mix up the palette. Now to the palette. So at this point, I'm going to squeeze out all of my tubes of paint, and then with that, create mixtures based on value, color, and temperature. And then, I will categorize them into 3 parts. So my lights will be on one side, my middles will be on another, and then my shadows will be on the third. So firstly, let me squeeze some paint out here. Here goes for my titanium white. And I always encourage people to be really generous with their paint. I'm going to put a lot of it in there. Okay, there's the first one. Secondly, for my primary yellow. Third, I've got my primary red. And last, I have ultramarine blue. And I like I said, I encourage students to use a lot of paint. And not to ever use student grade. Student grade is cheaper because it has less pigment in it. And so ultimately, it's harder to create good mixes since there's less pigment. And eventually, you'll be spending more money because you'll just need more of that paint. So I am not going to be using that transparent oxide red anymore. That was for my preliminary understudy part, and now it is all jewel colors. I want that students create their earth tones and their desaturated tones, and I already talked a lot about that, so we're just going to get right to the mixing at this point. So here we go. All right, so first thing is, just like I said, just like I talked about when I was talking about light, shadow, and value simplification on getting averages, that's pretty much what I'm going for now. So I'm looking at my model and deciding based on her complexion, about what hue, what family of color I'm going to be using for each of these categories, as stated, I am not really looking for the absolute lightest nor the absolute darkest within a category of tone, but somewhere average, and then across each category, I'm going to create a somewhat warmer versions of that color, or I should say of that value, and some cooler versions of that value, and just slight variations in value so that you have a little bit to work with. I'm looking at my model and deciding sort of an overall flesh in light complexion tone, how chromatic that is, what value it is, how warm or cool that is. It's important when I'm painting my flesh and light tones that I start with a nice big helping of white for a light complected person like Sion. You know what? By the way, I am a little chilly, and it's very important that you're always comfortable when you're painting. So allow me to put on my jacket right now. All right, so here's my white, nice big helping of white. And I am going to lay in a little bit of red. You can see how pink that gets, and a little bit of yellow. So right now, I'm going for trying to get the value, the average value that I see. And I'd say that's about approximately a 2-ish or so on my value scale. And so here, as I said earlier, now I have a really chromatic color, and that is definitely not too natural looking when it comes to skin. Now, when using a limited palette of just a few, the way to cut chroma or desaturate is just adding a little bit of the third color. So the third is my blue, and I'll just wipe this off so I can try to keep my little pools of paint clean. And now I'll grab a little bit of blue, and you can see how little I'm using. I try using it very sparingly as to not completely ruin a mix, because as you can see, as I'm mixing, a little goes a long way. So amazing how just adding that blue, I cooled it off, and I created something that looks a lot more natural, a lot more of a believable skin tone. I think I'll add just a little bit more yellow, just so it's a little less pink. So that's pretty much what you're doing. You're just, you're adding little bits and little bits until you get at something that approximates what you see up there. So here's sort of my starter color, and I'm going to create a little string of color here. So I'll create something that's maybe a wee bit warmer over here. Warmer by adding some yellow, a little more yellow. I will create something a bit cooler by adding a little more blue. And I'm kind of attaching or stringing them together, I should say. Now that went a little too blue, in my opinion. So how do I bring it back? I bring it back with adding a little, dipping into my my red again. Yeah. So it becomes an art form in and of itself, creating these subtle changes. As I'm looking at my model's complexion, I'm seeing some real subtle greens too. So let me sort of add to that and create some subtle greens. So you can see how these are all very similar values and just slightly different colors. I'll grab some more white, put it up top here, and create even a lighter value. All right, so I think I have some nice variation here in light. Next, I'm going to create some mixes for my middle tone. And I'll start off by creating some warm tone. And where I actually see this is where the turning of form happens, where light goes into shadow, and this area becomes some middle tone. I see middle tone happening in within the eye structure. There's a lot of turning of form that requires some middle tone, and there's some warmer middle tones within the eye structure. There's some cooler coming around the turning of the nose and so forth. And even as we move down the jaw, we get some, also some light middle. With middle, I'm going to just take a little bit of white and decent amount of red and some yellow, and look at that, that is bright. Grab a little more white, lighten that up a bit. And a little bit of blue to cut the chroma. So I'm just still playing until I get something that I think will be useful in my portrait here. A little more blue, cool it off, cut the chroma a little bit. Okay, all right, look at that. So you can see how things are starting to get, in these middles, things are getting a little kind of mauve-y, a little more muted, which is what I want. So I'm creating some darker versions of some of this stuff in the light. So again, a little string of them. All right. Now let me get some nice cools happening. I've got a bunch of warms, so throw some white over there and pop some blue in right away. Wow, that's a vivid blue. And you can see how I'm just dabbing at my, each of these colors. So, for me to describe what I put in all of these mixes, I'd just be repeating myself over and over because I'm putting the same colors in all the mixes, but I'm just using different concentrations of them. And that really just comes with practice, knowing just how much to use in whatever mix you're making. I'm going to go for a kind of a greenish one. That's very yellow. So now that I have the green, how do I cut it? I take red to gray it down. And that grays down nicely. I've been told that my palette, my palette in this stage looks like a makeup counter, like at the mall, which I think is sort of a compliment because I don't know, they always look very yummy to me. All right, so yeah, so you can just play and mix and get at making these grays. The more white dilutes, as I said earlier today, and so adding little bits of white to these mixes without getting too light in value will also enable you to get some more muted tones as well. So here I've got some stuff to go with in my middle category. And now I will get into my shadows. So this time I will not start with adding white, or I should say with starting with white, but I will start with everything but that, since we're going with shadow. So here we go, and look at that fire engine red, which looks like a crazy shadow color, but you'll see how fast it disappears with the help of my blue. And one thing I find really fun about doing all this mixing with minimal stuff is you just watch the colors evolve, and look at that. Look how muted that orange got. Now let me actually let me make up a darker, kind of a darker brown. There we go. More of a reddish brown there, and even a darker one with just a little less yellow. So who needs earth colors? I'm making them. All right, maybe something a little yellower. So here I go. I'm making a purple. Making up a purple. And then I cut my purple's chroma when I add some green, and that ends up being a really nice earthy tone. So speaking of relationships between light and shadow on human flesh, often you see, if you see this a somewhat pinkish, slightly pinkish skin tone, you're likely to think about the skin tone in shadow as a little greenish, like if thinking in terms of those opposites. And when I say greenish, I mean a very desaturated green, but nonetheless it's still in the green family. So that is I think it's helpful to think about color like that. Okay, so something that I see that I will use a lot is sort of some deep reds. When painting flesh, and you get into those little creases and crevices that all of us have. The older we get, the more we have. But getting into those really dark little bits of inside some of the eye structure, around nostrils, corners of mouth, that are fairly dark, but they're also very warm. Sometimes people make the mistake of getting a little cool in those areas. They think about them as dark, so they must be, I don't know, kind of bluish or deep dark. And the cooler you make those areas, I think, the less alive your subject looks. So it's real important to think about, just think about the blood flow there and why those areas should be warm. And also, in some of those little creased areas that are real deep and dark, they're catching reflected light from a neighboring, either a fold of skin or just a neighboring facial feature. And so skin reflecting on skin is going to be warm. So that's something to keep in mind. Okay, one last thing I'm going to pre-mix is some hair color. And so I can get a really nice, I'll put a real dark down here, really nice dark color with a lot of blue, a little red, and to cut, just to sort of de-purple it, a tiny bit of yellow. I don't want to do too much yellow because yellow is light and that'll lighten us a little too much. But you can see here, wow, look at that. It's like a deep dark brown that works for a lot of, I think, my model's hair color. This is a good place to just start. And as I'm speaking, I just realized that I forgot something. I'm concentrating on her flesh and her hair, and I forgot what she's wearing and also the flower in her hair. So we've got a lot of red on that. And so anyway, actually this deep red works for some of that, for some of the darker parts of the red. But I'm painting a sort of I guess a middle tone red, some lighter bits of red around the flower, and also along the straps, the little bows or the tied straps that are closer to the light, they've got some lighter tone red. And then you can see the underside of those, which are red in shadow. So all that said, I will just create a couple of pre-mixed colors on that note. Red is hard to lighten. Only certain reds maintain their integrity of staying red and not moving to pink so quickly. And I have to say, this particular red that I use has, is great because it does not move to pink too quickly. And so I also don't want it to be too chromatic. So here we go. So this is, that could work. And then just to get a red in shadow, a little pre-mixed action there, a red and blue, which is kind of what I did over here. I guess I'm just adding to it a little bit. So there'll be a few different tones, but that's something to work with. Okay, so you can see here in my pre-mix palette that there is some organization, and it will not stay like that. Everything start out lovely and categorized, and in the course of the painting, they all kind of start dancing together and combine. Well, now I have my colors mixed on my palette, so I'm ready to start laying in some color. One thing that I haven't done yet that I'd like to do is get in some background color information really before I start laying in the flesh, and that'll really help me to continue to get my values right by having this contrast between background and foreground. So let us see what to do now. I'll grab this brush, and so I've got a grayish background here, kind of a gray, dark middle, I'm going to call it. So I'm going to create that with, let's see, put that over here since it's sort of a dark tone. Grab my blue and my red. Go for now getting the value right. And dechromatizing some of that, let's see, not so bad. And, all right. That might be a little bit dark, but I'll just lay something down and continue to adjust it later. But right now, what's really important to me is describing this background, sort of immediately around the contour of my model. So I can really, really try to get that the edge looking to be where it is. And notice how I'm laying the paint down, guys. Picking up a lot of paint on my brush and, really just laying down a solid stroke. It's looking a little blue. I think I want to gray it down even a little more. That's a little grayer. All right. Yeah. So I'm just going to delicately, I'm not. There's that line you can see from my last painting, and I feel like what I'm laying in now is a little more true to what I see at this moment, and there's always subtle changes between pose sittings, and that's totally okay. It's part of the process. And so when I do get to bring paint over here, I'll show you how I try to create a soft edge, where paint meets paint. That's important to me. One thing is that the background on this side of my picture is a little lighter than on the left side because of this deep shadow behind her that's happening. So, you know what, maybe I will get that little bit of, like, especially in that negative space next to her neck. That would be nice to get a dark in there. And here, for the first time, I'm just going to take a little dip into my oil, just so that I can just spread this around a little bit quickly. So, notice that between strokes, I really try to clean my brush well as to not make mud on my palette. When I switch, I'll switch brushes when I want to switch size, but not necessarily, or brush texture, but not necessarily between colors. So I just like to make sure that I've cleaned my brush enough. All right, so now is where I will begin to lay some flesh and light color in, and dipping into the piles I just created. So what I'll do is, out of these various subtle, different flesh and light colors that I made, subtly different, I should say, flesh and light colors that I made, I will be laying them down, paying mind to the plane differences I see, as well as the slight value variations that I see. As sort of in the middle of the face, like right around, basically in here, eyes, around the nose, into the lips, cheeks right here. Things are a little more saturated in color. And then as we move away, basically move around this plane, move off into the distance, information gets both a little bit darker in value, as well as a little less chromatic, and a little cooler. So keeping that in mind, even as I lay down these initial flesh and light tones. I always get a little bit of, nervousness on putting that first stroke of flesh and light color onto my canvas, thinking to myself, is this going to be a proper mix? And sometimes you put it down and you realize, well, it looked a certain way down here, but it's not quite where I want it when I put it on my panel, and so you just mix a little more up. Not a big deal. All right, so at this moment, I'm kind of, I'm thinking about these front planes that I'm mixing. Front planes that on which I'm applying paint to. Maybe light. Notice the way I'm applying this plane. This is all front plane information, and so I'm applying it as such, applying front plane, and I've created again slightly different tones here to describe the slightly different planes. And I will hop into my my original color and make a little adjustment as I see fit. Realizing, like, no, I just want to get like just a half step of a value darker than what I had. The lovely thing about spending a fair amount of time on that underpainting is that I've got this structure that that I'm going to try to stay true to. And yeah, I just want to get just a wee bit darker in value, I'm realizing, as I move across the flesh and light. So, I mean, as you can see, like, looking at Sion and watching me apply paint on these areas, like, these are really subtle shifts, which is why when I initially mixed them, I kept them really, really close, and so I'm not deviating too much from that initial attempt. I'm just, I'm examining everything a little more closely now that I'm spending time with it. There, and so yeah, it's just a subtly darker one. And getting just a little, there we go. Still staying in my light. Yeah, I like that. That's a good tone. That is still a light tone. It's just, on a plane turn. So I am still using the same brush, guys. This is a nice, using a brush this size on this surface, and allows me to lay in a brush stroke that describes like a nice sized area. I'm not, what I'm not doing, and what I discourage people from doing, is coloring in. Sometimes I see people doing this kind of thing. They have a tiny little brush, and they're going like this, coloring in an area, and And it just, it's not very clean looking. Mm-hmm. So as we move down her face, we get just a little cooler, a little less saturated. And even along this little, that turn of form right near her eye is slightly cooler and slightly less saturated. And that whole area, let's see, right alongside, excuse me, her nose is going to be kind of pretty, a fairly darker flesh and light tone, bordering on a light middle tone. So I'm going to be careful of that, what I put in there. Again, now here we have front plane. That is bringing in, as you can see, this is where I start my merging into the middle, but probably right there. Might be a little too light, actually. But that's, yeah. Probably darken that in my next step. But let's see here. Mm-hmm. And so a little bit. Whoop, that, look at that. It's you know, you always notice when you put when you sort of overshoot it, and I overshot that light on her chin. So let's just withdraw that a little bit, adjust it. Okay. All right. Just noticing that I want to make sure to keep my shadow shapes correct. There will lightly be some refining of some of those initial marks I made. Once you start adding color and moving into a subsequent stage, it's easy to lose some of your nice marks that you made, and that just happens naturally. All right, so I'm going to get now even a bigger brush, try this guy. All right, so yeah, so let me mix up or add a little more paint to this. My my mixture for this sort of middle-ish light, average light, I should say. See what that looks like. Maybe cool that off a little bit. Maybe add a little bit of my yellow tone. And here I will dip just slightly into some oil and just, actually I do want to continue to cool that off a little now that I'm laying it down and seeing how warm it is. All right. Okay, so just basically massing some of this light in. And I'm noticing, you know, as I lay some color down, you know, noticing some variation where I see some slightly pinker areas, slightly yellow areas, slightly greener areas. So I will take that into account as I mass it in. You know, in this, covering like a pretty vast area like this, I'm not so concerned at this moment in, you know, really getting at my chroma, you know, my chroma so spot on. I will definitely get to this later. It just helps me visually to see some of the right value down more than anything. And just notice how I'm laying down these big strokes with different brush orientations, sort of a flatter area, and I just want some interesting variation before in an area where I don't have to describe a whole lot of movement. I'm needing a lot more of that mix. So actually, let me get a little significantly more down. All right, and now cool it, yellow it, and all that stuff gets fairly dark and is definitely different than that other flesh, but I'll just put a couple of notes in there. And now her neck is actually a little darker. I wouldn't say mid-tone, but it's definitely darker than this chest area. So let me just load up get a little more paint in my pile here for some of that darker color that I see in her neck. And that could work. And you can see you know, when I butt it up to that lighter color, you definitely can see that change, slightly different value. and some of you can see her her bones, her clavicles, her neck, and that will be something that we want to pay mind to when I get more in depth in this area later. And that information coming around, or whoops, in that neck area, gets a little warmer in there. Bringing in some of that little bit of warmth. All right, just getting some more paint on the panel. So, right, talking about edges before, bringing this information into this information, or I should say, kind of like turning this little bit of shoulder area and that little bit of the side of her neck and upper shoulder into the depth, into the back. I will basically just get a slightly cooler and I'll be working on that area, getting into more mid-tone information. One thing I just want to check. Yes, just double checking myself as to really where that line of her dress would be. It's never going to be on my panel, but I just need to know for reference. And basically, it's the length of her head, the length of the crown to chin. So it would be all the way down to where my finger is, which gives me a little bit of a marker as to some of her topography right about here, where I can start seeing just like the littlest bit of indentation of where her beyond her breastbone. So just to give me a landmark there. All right. Okay, all right. So this is the initial stage here. Let me, I'm going to look in my little mirror again, see how this is looking. Okay. Yeah, got some color on there. That'll work. Hi, I'm Jennifer Balkan and welcome to my workshop. In this workshop, I plan to show you how I use my chromatic limited palette. I love using color. In my own work, I seek to augment nature a bit by injecting my paintings with a little more saturated color than really exists. I believe that I can create the illusion of a little more vibrancy and life than I actually see. In this workshop, I'm going to introduce you to my chromatic limited palette. Using this palette, you'll be able to achieve color harmony effortlessly. You'll be using 3 main colors plus white, and ultimately you're using all these colors at the same time. So because you're using your entire palette, the effects are quite visually pleasing. One of the most exciting things about this video is that once you can master, work with, and then ultimately master this chromatic limited palette, I really truly believe that you can mix any paint. So I think of it as a superpower. Your ability to identify hue or family of color and then adjust it chromatically and regarding temperature while staying true to value will just be something that becomes intuitive to you.
I love how she paints. That was Jennifer Balkan and Limited Palette Portraits. If you want to learn more about that, go to lilyartvideo.com. Let's get into her head a little bit now and we'll do an interview.
I started painting, or I started just dabbling, and when I was in middle school, I believe, I found my grandmother's paints. But I really didn't do much more than that and didn't really get into it until about 2001. I would describe my painting style as expressive realism or contemporary optical mixed realism or something like that. I've always been drawn to painting the human face. It's really what drove me to start painting in the first place. And I find that when I'm painting the face, I'm thinking about the journey and life that person has had up until that point. And so I think about it as actually a map of telling a story, telling that person's story in paint and emotion. I feel that painting from life or observation is tantamount to learning how to really properly paint the figure or face. It is so important to understand the anatomy, the structure underneath the skin, and using any reference that's not from observation can be very limiting. They can be really helpful tools, but I truly believe that the only way to improve your skills is to understand how light falls across something from observation. Photos can be really flat, and so then once you understand this relationship between light and shadow and the structure behind the form that you're painting, you've got that knowledge that you can use to fill in any kind of blanks that you see when using a reference. I consider myself to be a colorist. I love saturated color, and the thing is, years ago, when I was, I guess, starting out painting, I would use probably about 13 or 14 different colors, and they would pretty much depend on who I was studying or kind of, I guess, mimicking at the time. And then at some point, a certain number of colors became my palette. And I would think about color relationships fairly technically. That is, when composing a composition, I would set out to ensure that my palette was split complementary, or just really thinking about the correct color relationships. And then some years later, when I discovered the limited palette, I didn't have to think about those relationships anymore because I was using all of my paint simultaneously, and so things were harmonious automatically. And where I thought that I had a pretty good handle on color before that, I feel much more confident and competent about my color relationships now. Staying inspired to paint and make art is not hard for me. I am constantly inspired. I see incredible work through my social media feed every day, and this fuels me. This excites me. I always want to try something a little different and a little new, and so I actually can't not paint for too long. And if I go a little too long without painting, I start feeling blue and uncomfortable. So I'm happy to say, at least in this moment in my life, I am inspired.
I love Jennifer. She's got so much vibrancy and so much energy, and what a great painter. That was Limited Palette Portraits with Jennifer Balkan. You can learn more about that at lilyartvideo.com. Stay safe. I'm Eric Rhodes.
Hi, I'm Jennifer Balkan, and welcome to my workshop. In this workshop, I plan to show you how I use my chromatic limited palette. I love using color. In my own work, I seek to augment nature a bit by injecting my paintings with a little more saturated color than really exists. I believe that I can create the illusion of a little more vibrancy and life than I actually see. In this workshop, I'm going to introduce you to my chromatic limited palette. Using this palette, you'll be able to achieve color harmony effortlessly. You'll be using 3 main colors plus white, and ultimately you're using all these colors at the same time. So because you're using your entire palette, the effects are quite visually pleasing. One of the most exciting things about this video is that once you can master, work with, and then ultimately master this chromatic limited palette, I really truly believe that you can mix any paint. So I think of it as a superpower. Your ability to identify hue or family of color and then adjust it chromatically and regarding temperature while staying true to value will just be something that becomes intuitive to you.